Well, I've been doing a lot of research this last week into Navy SEALs. I'm not sure if anyone is a fan of Navy SEALs, has ever watched a movie about Navy SEALs. Anyone slightly interested in Navy SEALs? All right, well, maybe by the end of tonight, you will be. The Navy SEALs are considered probably one of the most rigorous and advanced training programs that our military offers. And the process is so grueling and so hard that they have a 70 to 80% failure rate. So 70 to 80% of the people that go in that are saying, hey, I'm prepared for this is my future, this is something I am going to do, are not able to complete the things that are required for them to do to make it through it. And so within usually the first couple of weeks, they break it up into different sections to train on different things. But within the first couple of weeks, they have something that is dubbed Hell Week. And so it is dubbed that because of how rigorous and how hard it is. It consists of 5.5 days of cold, wet, brutally difficult operational training. And every day they get fewer than 4 hours of sleep. And so I'm not sure, maybe some of you right now, you're like, I operate on less than 4 hours of sleep every day and I'm just fine. Well, we're not finished yet. These trainees are constantly in motion. They are running. They are carrying things. They are rowing. They are swimming. They carry logs. They carry their boats. They're crawling in sand. They're covered in mud. And then when they're not actively doing over those things, they are standing in different formations, holding certain positions. They are halfway covered in the ocean and wet and wind being just coming at them and just I'm not sure if you've ever been cold and the wind's blown on you before. It's not a great feeling. They're in the sand and they're chafing and all kinds of things for 5.5 days. They're just going through this and going through this and going through this. And while they're going through this, they're being asked to perform very difficult tasks. So, see, those are just the things that they're doing to complete the tasks. Those aren't just the tasks. They're asked to complete tasks that make them think, lead, make decisions in moments of crisis while they are sleep deprived, approaching hypothermia, and oftentimes hallucinating what's going on because of the lack of sleep that they have. There's cases of when they're eating, people just sleeping like head in the food that's in front of them because the moment they had to sit still, they immediately fell asleep. People often fall asleep in their boats and fall into the water, and then they have to go rescue them. And that is how intense this is. And like I said, 70 to 80% of the people that go through it don't make it. They give up. They can't make it through this. And if you maybe you're thinking like people like sign up to do this. Like they want to do this, like this is their choice. They didn't do something wrong and someone forced them to go do this. They actually chose to go do these things. And the answer is yes. And the people who have made it through, the 20 to 30% that makes it through, if you asked any of one of them if they would do it again, they would say absolutely. That every single moment of it was worth it. And it seems like that there is something that is going on in the midst of all of the difficult things that they have to do that makes it worth it. That there's something in the midst of all of the difficulty and pain that they have to endure that makes it worth it. And as we kind of dive into where we're going today, my hope is that you realize the same thing is true for us. The same thing is true for us, that in the midst of difficulty and pain that we face, that if we have the right perspective, that we will see that some of the things that we go through, that there's actually a purpose in it, and that God can actually use it for good. And so we've been in our series called Wrecked, talking about the life of the Apostle Paul, and I gave you a definition for wrecked a couple of weeks ago, that it's a violent and sudden collision. And that's what we see in Paul's story, that he was on a road, on his way to go kill Christians. And Jesus and the gospel of Christ violently collided with Paul's life and completely wrecked him. And his life was changed forever. And we talked last week about how God began to develop and God began to grow Paul. And I don't have this up on the screens, but one of the very first things that God says to Paul is, I'm going to show you how much you are going to suffer for my name. Sounds really exciting, right? Like imagine filling out a job description and they're like, you're like, hey, so like, what is this job like? You're going to suffer a lot. It's actually my point and my purpose to show you how much you're going to suffer for this job. You're not going to get paid very well. It's going to be very difficult at times. But at the end, it's going to be worth it. And maybe like a lot of the people that go into the Navy SEALs training program, it's not going to work out. The 70 to 80% are not going to make it. I want to give you a new definition for wrecked for what we're going to talk about today. Wrecked can mean wounded, afflicted, and to wreak havoc upon. Wounded, afflicted, to wreak havoc upon. And today we're going to look at the suffering that Paul endured during his life, some of these moments of suffering, and the perspective that he not only had during it, but as he's older and later in life, looking back on the moments of his life, what he would say in reflection. Well, what do you say? Hey, now that I'm at the end of my life, as I look back at all the suffering and all the things that I dealt with, this is what I see now. Paul was very familiar with suffering in 1 Corinthians. He goes into extreme detail about some of the suffering he went through. I have a kind of a synopsis of it for you right here. He was whipped 39 times on 5 different occasions, beaten with sticks on 3 different occasions. He was pummeled with stones. He was shipwrecked 3 times. And, I get that. I'm not sure if you know about a lot of my stories. Like I've tried to go on 4 different cruises and they keep getting canceled because of hurricanes and storms. So I've never been able to go on a cruise, but like I have a feeling it might be a lot like Paul. Like, things might happen if I ever get on that boat out in the middle of the water. And you would think after the first time, right, you get on the boat, hey, we're going somewhere, Titanic situation-like thing happening, and you survive and you come out and you're like, something was wrong with that boat. We just need to try a different boat. And then you go again and you're on the boat and it crashes again. Things go bad again and you're like, you know what? 3rd time's the charm, right? 3rd time's the charm. It's just the boat. Now I'm going to go on a 3rd boat. Same thing happens again. You think he'd figure it out. Maybe just like start investing in like some floaties, a pool, I don't know, a different mode of transportation. He was adrift at sea. He toiled and endured many hardships. He had many sleepless nights. He was hungry and thirsty often. He was often cold and exposed to the elements. Yet in his writings to the church at Rome, as he's older in life, kind of finishing up his journey, trying to get to the believers at Rome, this is what he writes. He says, not only that, but we rejoice in our sufferings. We rejoice in our sufferings. I'm not sure how many of you, when you think about suffering, that you feel like that's a situation you find a lot of joy in. Those are situations that you should rejoice in. A lot of times, and for me, when you're just looking at it at face value, it's more often, hey, I want to do the opposite of rejoice in suffering. I want to complain in suffering. I want an alternative to suffering. I want to avoid suffering at every chance I can. But here he says to rejoice in suffering. And the reality is you have probably experienced suffering. You might be experiencing suffering or pain right now, or you will be experiencing suffering and pain at one point. It is universal. There is no one that escapes it. And I don't know what suffering looks like for you. Like maybe for you, suffering is when they get your Starbucks order wrong. And you needed a little caffeine and you've just been waiting on it and waiting on it and waiting on it. And then you finally get it and you're just like, caffeine. And you drink it and they use oat milk instead of almond. and you're just not sure if you're going to make it now, right? Like you're just not sure if you're going to get through this injustice. Maybe for you, you got cut off in traffic, right? You were driving with your family, or maybe for some of our older students who you're driving and someone's cut you off, and you're like, why me? Why did this have to happen to me? Maybe you're on a sports team and your team loses, or your car breaks down, right? And you're just like, God, why do these things keep happening to me? Why do I have to suffer so much? Maybe your favorite TV show gets canceled, or your boyfriend or girlfriend breaks up with you, and you're sitting there and you're just asking the question, why? Why me? Why am I counted to suffer in such a way? The brother of Jesus, James, actually writes in James chapter 1, verse 2, he says, "Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds." Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds. So it's not just like when you experience one suffering, but he says, when you experience all of the sufferings, I want you to count it as joy. So when you show up and your Starbucks order is wrong, and as you're sipping on that wrong oat milk Starbucks, and you drive out and someone cuts you off, and because they cut you off, you were late to where you needed to go, and your team lost your game. And then because your team lost your game, you were in a bad mood, and on your way home, your car breaks down. And as you're trying to figure out what to do with your car, and you get it towed, you finally get home, and you just want to relax. And there it is. Your favorite TV show has been canceled. And you call your boyfriend or your girlfriend to complain to them about all the terrible and horrible things that has happened to you, and they let you know, this just isn't working out. And it says, hey, I want you to count all of it as joy. That doesn't make a lot of sense, right? Like that doesn't factor into the way we think, the way we act. And we're laughing, and like these are real things. Like these aren't fun things. Like we aren't excited about these things. But I feel like there's other layers to suffering. Like suffering can be deeper. Like how are we supposed to act when someone we care about dies? That's another layer of suffering. When a family member is sick. When the thing that we've been hoping for and dreaming for, maybe we've been praying for over and over and over again, and it just doesn't happen, and we're left asking why. How do we respond in that situation? What are we supposed to think in those situations? And maybe more important than that, what do we think about God in those situations? What do we think about God in those situations? Like I said, Paul is telling us to rejoice. James is telling us to count it all joy. How do you do that when you're in the midst of loss, of grief, of pain, of suffering? How are you supposed to see it that way as life is just tossing you back and forth? You have pain and suffering with your friends. Pain and suffering with your families, pain and suffering in your relationships, with your health. Whatever the situation is, I'm sure you don't have to think very hard to identify what area of your life feels a lot like pain and suffering right now. I think the most common thought when we try to answer the question, how do we react and how do we think about God? Oftentimes we feel like we're being punished. Oftentimes, it's so easy to feel like we're being punished in those situations, right? That God is doing this to us in response to something that we've done, right? There's something that we've done along the way. You know, we lied about this, and he's like, sickness. You know, we cheated on a test. He's like, car broken down, right? That's how we often think about God. We look back and say, what did I do that would make God do this to me? It's a lot like one of my favorite scenes in one of my favorite shows, Parks and Rec. There's a scene that I think captures this perfectly, so I want to show it to you because I don't want us to be like this. So y'all check this video out.
How you like that? Now imagine you're holding coffee.
This is outrageous. Where are the armed men who cut come in to take the protesters away. Where are they? This kind of behavior is never tolerated in Boracua. You shout like that, they put you in jail right away. No trial, no nothing. Journalists, we have a special jail for journalists. You're stealing, right to jail. You're playing music too loud, right to jail, right away. You're driving too fast, jail. Slow, jail. You're charging too high prices for sweaters, glasses, you right to jail. You undercook fish, believe it or not, jail. You overcook chicken, also jail. Undercook, overcook. You make an appointment with the dentist and you don't show up, believe it or not, jail, right away. We have the best patients in the world because of jail.
See, isn't that great? One of my favorite clips, one of my favorite shows. But here's the thing, we laugh, but so many times, our first thought when we're in the midst of pain and when we're in the midst of suffering is that, I did something, punishment. I did something, pain. I did something, suffering. And can I tell you something? If you read the scripture and you hear the way that God talks about you and you see the character of God on display, you would see that that is not how God operates. In fact, it is just the opposite. In fact, if we look at the cross, we see we did something, grace. The area that we rebelled, that we sinned, that we messed up, Jesus on the cross, not us. It's the exact opposite. Here's my first point for you guys today if you're taking notes. Pain is not punishment. Pain is not punishment. I want to help us kind of think a little bit and have a better worldview or idea of the way that we think about pain and suffering. There's a couple of ways that we can think about it. The first one, which I feel like is very often, is sometimes the pain and the suffering that we experience are simply the consequences of our own actions. That it's not God punishing us in response to something we've done, but God has instructed how life is worked. You know, we just went through the book of Proverbs, and Solomon is like, hey, if you walk with the wise, you'll be wise, but if you walk with the foolish, you'll be in trouble, right? We want to think, hey, you walk with the wise, you'll be wise. You walk with the foolish, you'll be foolish. No, that's not what he says. Hey, walk with the wise, be wise. Walk with the foolish, you'll be in trouble. And some of us walk foolishly, and we find ourselves with trouble all around us, and we're wondering, like, why are you punishing me? He already told you what was going to happen. And some of us, times we experience consequences of our own actions. And that's not a new idea. Jesus actually corrected people on this idea. Jesus was walking and teaching one time, and there's a paralyzed man in front of them, and people came up to Jesus, and they said, hey, whose sin caused this man to be paralyzed, his mother or his father? And Jesus responded. He said, hey, neither of their sin caused this man to be paralyzed, but God is going to use this for his glory. He said it's not this person's sin that caused this action to happen. He said it's not that person's sin that caused this action to happen. And yes, sometimes we will have consequences to our actions, but God isn't just sitting there waiting for you to mess up so he can punish you, right? That's not the heart and the character of God. But he can use it. Another kind of way for us to think about it. These aren't, I try not to make blanket statements that can be misinterpreted. And that's why I say the word sometimes. It's not all encompassing. Sometimes the pain and suffering that we deal with is the consequences of our own actions. Sometimes the pain and suffering that we deal with are simply because we live in a fallen world. God created the world to be great. God created things to work in the way that he wanted. And when sin entered the world, it broke the way that he created it. And now that it is broken, we experience that all around us. That as we see pain and suffering, as we experience pain and suffering in our lives, as we have family members who pass away, as we walk through periods of trial or periods of suffering, whatever that is, that we would see that and we would experience that, and that would create something inside us that says there is something that is not right here. That we would recognize, hey, there is something that doesn't feel all right. I just lost someone I care about. There is something wrong here. that doesn't feel right. Man, I'm walking through something right now. I'm walking through something with a friend. I'm walking through something at school, and it feels like pain, and it feels like suffering, and this isn't right. And when you feel like it's not right, it's supposed to point you to a God who created all things good, who knows what is right, and who has instructed you to be that way. But Paul is also going to give us another category. He says sometimes God is not the cause of our pain. He is not punitive. He is not punishing us. But sometimes he will allow us to experience pain and suffering because he is going to use it in only ways that he can. Paul talks about this in Romans chapter 5, verse 3. He says, not only that, but we rejoice in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance. And endurance produces character, and character produces hope. And hope does not put us to shame because God's love has been poured into our hearts through the Holy Spirit he has given to us. And so he's saying a lot here. We've talked about this a little bit here before, and he's giving us some words, almost like a pathway. And he says, hey, some of you guys are experiencing suffering. Like you're experiencing things that you don't want to deal with. You're experiencing things that are difficult. You're experiencing things that are painful. And he says, but I can use that. And that suffering actually produces, the word produces means to grow. If you think about planting or things like that, you are producing something. It says your suffering can produce, it can grow endurance in you. That word endurance is also translated steadfastness, steadiness. It is literally the idea of you keep walking, and no matter what comes along with you, nothing stops you. You keep going. If you think of an endurance runner, a marathon runner, I've told you guys before, my wife runs marathons. You know how you finish a marathon? You just keep going. For me, it feels like you're going forever, right? But you just endurance, that nothing will shake you, nothing will stop you, that you just keep going. And he says that suffering that you go through, that God begins to work in that. He produces endurance in you, the ability to keep going, just one more step. And maybe things are difficult, and maybe things are hard, and maybe they don't make sense, but you're able to take one more step. And things are still difficult, and things are still hard, and things still don't make sense, but you're able to take one more step. And God says, hey, in that process, your endurance produces character, who you are, your endurance, your ability to take one more step in the midst of difficulty. And I don't know what your suffering is right now, but your ability to take one more step shapes who you are the next day, the next year, later on in your life. And he says, as your character is being shaped, that produces hope in you. It says, because he has been faithful to you in your past, because he has been with you every step you were able to take, you now have hope for the future steps that you have to take, because you know he's still going to be there with you. But here's the thing, we don't want that process, right? Like that sounds good and that sounds great and that sounds like God's going to do something. But I think most of us, if there is an exit to just avoid the pain, if there's an exit to just avoid the suffering, that's where we would get off. And it sounds great that God is going to take our suffering and produce endurance, and take our endurance and produce character, and take our character and produce hope. But I think if we were really honest in our hearts, we would say, hey, God, I'm not sure that is worth what I'm going through. I don't think that's worth what I've experienced. And maybe a lot of times we even get angry at him because it feels like we're just going in the midst of pain and suffering, in the mess of all of it, and it just feels like it's pointless. Like it's just senselessness going on around us. Here's my second point for you. Our pain is not wasted. Our pain is not wasted. As I was doing my research on different Navy SEALs training and things like that, the program that they go through is called BUDS. And so, and it's just this really hard course that they go through. That's the whole point of it, that it is difficult, that it is something that is going to test them, that is going to be a period of painfulness, that is going to be a period of producing something in them. And BUD stands for Basic Underwater Demolition, and for the SEAL team. And so if you ask them what their perspective of after going through it, they will tell you that not only was it worth it, the people that made it all the way through the process, they took another step when it was difficult. When they were waist deep in freezing cold water, they took another step. As they carried their boat over their heads, they took another step. They said not only was it worth it, but it was necessary for the future things that they had to walk through. It was necessary. It's not wasted. And that's the same idea that Paul is trying to communicate. And the reason we can trust that Paul knows it is because Paul walked through it. Paul lived through it. As we look in the book of Acts, one of the other stories in Paul's life, we're going to be in Acts chapter 16. We're going to see Paul is out now. He's been developed. God has saved him radically, grown him up. He is now ministering, teaching people, and people are coming against him. People are angry about him teaching people about Jesus. In verse 22, it says, the crowd joined in attacking them, and the magistrates tore the garments off them and gave orders to beat them with rods. And when they had inflicted many blows upon them, they threw them into prison, ordering the jailer to keep them safely. Don't forget that. Having received this order, he put them into the inner prison and fastened their feet in the stocks. I said earlier that we're all going to experience suffering. You may be walking out of it. You may be walking through it right now, or you might be walking into it tomorrow or the next day or the next year, but we're all going to experience it. And sometimes I feel like the worst type of suffering is when you feel like you're trying to do the right thing and the suffering is happening regardless of our actions. Maybe you felt that way. Paul right here is just trying to simply tell people about Jesus, and he's getting beat and thrown in jail over it. I'm not sure what the last situation for you where you felt like you were trying to do the right thing and suffering and pain came around it. But I would think if it resulted in being beat and jail time, you might be like, hey, I'm not sure if I'm going to do it that way again. Hey, I might try a different route. I might try a different alternative. The story continues. It says, about midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God, and the prisoners were listening to them. And suddenly there was a great earthquake, so that the foundations of the prison were shaken. And immediately all the doors were open, and everyone's bonds were unfastened. When the jailer woke and saw that the prison doors were open, he drew his sword and was about to kill himself, supposing that the prisoners had escaped. As always, whenever we're reading a story, I want you to put yourself in Paul's situation. So, put your thinking caps on, get ready. You are in prison for just simply trying to do something good, simply trying to tell people about Jesus. You've been beaten, you've been hurt, you've been mocked, you're sitting in prison, and now miraculously all the doors open up. I feel like the first logical thought and the first logical thing to do is simply to walk out, right? I was doing the right thing all along, and now God is showing up for me. I was doing the right thing all along, and now God is working for me. Yet, Paul was aware of what was happening around him. You see, I told you earlier to remember, it said that the jailer's job was to keep them safely. And the Roman guard would have been responsible for all of the prisoners leaving. And so right now in this moment, he knows that he is probably going to be executed. So the best thing he can do right now is to simply take his own life to avoid all of the shame for his family and all of that stuff, the process of going through court, the process of all of those things, because he knows execution is his future. And yet in that moment, where most of us would probably have thought, God showed up for me, Paul knew that God showed up to work through me. And the story continues. But Paul cried out with a loud voice, "Do not harm yourself, for we are all here." The jailer called for lights and rushed in, and trembling with fear, he fell down before Paul and Silas. Listen, Paul didn't know what was going to happen next in his story. Paul didn't know that when he was getting beaten, what God was up to, what God was working at. He didn't know when the jail doors was open, what God was up to. But the difference between Paul, and I think a lot of us would do, Paul wasn't looking for the exit of his suffering. He was looking for the opportunity in his suffering. And because he was sensitive and aware of what was going around him and the opportunity of his suffering, he saw a place that God was going to work through him, that God could work through him. And he knew that if I eased my suffering now and left, that would create suffering for this other person. And he chose to sacrifice for himself so that God might just show up for this other person. And listen, here's the crazy thing. God showed up in the middle of their suffering, not to save them, but to use them to save their jailer. Just when you think they're trying to do the right thing, they're in the midst of suffering, they're in the midst of pain, they've been beaten, they're sitting in a jail cell, and God shows up. Man, wouldn't he show up just to save me? But yet God showed up to do so much more than that. You see, he showed up not only to just save the jailer, but we'll see that eventually he saves the jailer's whole family through Paul's obedience, through Paul's sensitivity to the opportunity that was in front of him in that moment. Here's something I want you guys to remember. How we respond in the midst of suffering displays what we really believe about God. How we respond in the midst of suffering displays what we really believe about God. And here's what Paul knew, because he wrote it in Romans later to us. Paul knew that he had been through some past difficulties, some past sufferings. And because he had walked through those past sufferings, God had produced some past endurance in him. And he had taken another step, and he had taken another step, and he had taken another step. And because of his past endurance, God had created present character for him that shaped who he was to be sensitive to what God was doing in that moment. And that present character gave him future hope that God was going to do something more than he could ever imagine. And listen, it doesn't sound good, but Paul was willing to do that even if he had to sit in his suffering for a little bit longer. The story ends in verse 30. It says, "Then he brought them out and said, 'Sirs, what must I do to be saved?' And they said, 'Believe in the Lord Jesus, and you will be saved and your household.' And they spoke the word of the Lord to him and all who were in his house. And he took them the same hour of the night, washed their wounds, and he was baptized at once, he and all of his family. And then he brought them up to his house, and he set the food before him. And he rejoiced along with his entire household that he had believed in God." And God used Paul's specific suffering in that moment to not only save his jailer, but his jailer's whole family. And like I said, when Paul was getting beat in the middle of the streets, he didn't know what God was up to. And when he was sitting in the prison cell singing hymns and praising God, he didn't know what God was up to. But I feel like when you get to the end of the story, he would say, it was worth it. It wasn't wasted. It wasn't punishment. And listen, I don't know what you're walking in right now. But if someone told you a week ago, 2 weeks ago, 5 years ago before you started walking through whatever it is you're walking through and told you what God was up to in the midst of it and what God was going to do at the end of it, man, maybe it's worth it. Maybe we have to sit a little bit longer in our suffering so that people would be saved, so that families can be reconciled, so that we can be sensitive to the needs and the opportunities that God has put around us. And I don't know what that future is for you. But I know that there is purpose in your pain that God is using to prepare you. There is purpose in your pain that God is using to prepare you. And like I said, I don't know what it is for. I was listening to a story of a specific Navy SEAL lieutenant named Gene Hamilton, and he was telling the story about how he ended up picking up a flight going over Vietnam. And their plane ended up getting shot down. And as he pulled his parachute and all the people who were with him died, he found himself behind enemy lines in the middle of Vietnam, all alone. And as it turns out, he begins communicating with the United States and trying to form this rescue plan. And they find out that they're right in the middle of North Vietnam attacking South Vietnam. And they find themselves into the middle of it. And there's this whole war going on. And they're sending rescue attempt after rescue attempt after rescue attempt. And it keeps failing. And people keep dying. And Gene is sleeping in a hole that he dug in the ground, covered in leaves. It's raining, and all this stuff is going on around him. And it would have been easier just to give up. He talks at the end of his story. He's like, there was times where I thought it was easier to give up. That as they kept sending rescue attempts, and people kept dying because of me, I was wondering if it was going to be worth it. And so at the end, he begins actually getting intelligence on what's going on in Vietnam and being able to communicate that to the United States. They end up being able to thwart this big disaster thing from happening. He ends up being rescued 11 and a half days later, and as he's walking out of it, people are asking him, man, how did you make it? How did you survive? How did you get through these things? He says, I was prepared for this moment a long time ago. You see, I had to walk through some things in training, and I had to walk through some things in different missions, and I had to walk through some things in life. And while those were difficult, those difficulties began producing something in me, the ability to keep going. And that as I kept going, I became the type of person who was able to survive. It's known as one of the greatest rescue stories that we know. And listen, I don't think that's going to be your story. I don't think you're going to find yourself behind enemy lines in Nam, all right? But I do know that God has a future prepared for you, that He is preparing you for right now in the pain that you're walking to. Your pain is preparation. Now, I don't know why you have to go through it. I don't have all the answers, but what I do know that if you don't go through it, you're not going to grow through it. And that God is preparing you for something, and I feel like when we get at the end of it, we're going to say it's worth it. That He was up to something that's so much bigger than us, that He was saving people, that He's doing God-sized things that only He can do. And so maybe we might have to sit in our suffering just a little bit longer, but know that you're not being punished and that it's not wasted. We don't enjoy the pain. We don't enjoy the suffering. But we can find joy in the midst of it because we know that God is doing something, and He has not left us, and He has not abandoned us, and He has not stopped loving and caring for us no matter what's